Allegations of dirty tricks in Mexico's election, and also allegations of media bias against the left in Mexico and elsewhere in Latin America. Do conservative interests get an unfair advantage in the press? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu. He thought he'd won on Sunday, but Enrique Pena Nieto will have to wait to be officially crowned Mexico's president-elect. That's after election officials announced that they were recounting more than half the ballot boxes in the presidential election. But there's also an allegation of vote buying, with Pena Nieto's Institutional Revolutionary Party accused of trading votes for shopping vouchers and other gifts. Leading those allegations is this man, the second-placed candidate, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. But he's also leveling another allegation about the campaign.
As all of you know, the support from the media in favor of Enrique Pena Nieto was evident. Most of the media sponsored him.
He's not the only leftist political leader in Latin America accusing the media of being biased. In Venezuela, President Hugo Chavez has long railed against his country's television channels and newspapers, whom he accuses of backing an attempted coup against him in 2002. Ecuador's Rafael Correa and Argentina's Cristina Kirchner have also battled alleged media bias, but all three have in turn been accused of censorship and trying to squash dissent in the ways they've tackled the press. Back in Mexico, our Latin America editor Lucia Newman asked Enrique Pena Nieto about the accusations of irregularities and media favoritism.
This is the third Mexican election that I've witnessed where there have been some questions about the legitimacy of the process. So I'd like to know if, when you are president, whether you would propose any specific reforms to ensure that no political party can outspend another, or that no political party can pay, for example, for favorable electoral coverage.
This type of observation that you are making, Lucia, is part of a campaign orchestrated by my adversaries.
So you say that none of this is true?
None of it is true. And what I say is present the proof, which they haven't been able to do. And no matter how hard they try to present proof, they will simply not be able to do it because they don't exist. There has not been a relationship, supposedly one of favoritism, with the mass media. We have had a transparent relationship with the mass media. I think Mexico has made democratic strides that some do not want to recognize, and they do not recognize it when the results of the votes don't favor them, because we don't hear the same complaints from this same person when he was elected mayor of Mexico City. In that instance, we had serious institutions and a trustworthy counting system. When you win, it exists. When you lose, you do not want to recognize.
Let me just return to this theme of transparency. During the political debate, you said that you would favor ending the sort of quasi-monopoly, as some call it, of Mexico's largest television network. Will you be opening up, or be in favor of opening up the airwaves to others?
Sí, y además, as I have been saying throughout my campaign, we need to stimulate greater competition throughout all economic activities in our country, not just in the area of telecommunications, which without a doubt is necessary, and we will do it. But all economic activities, we need to have more competition to benefit all Mexicans. We need to give Mexicans the opportunity to buy better products at better prices and offer more variety from which they can choose. And this is what will produce the competition that we want to promote during my time in office.
So, is the media fair in Latin America? With me to discuss this is Rick Rockwell from American University, a former advisor to Argentina's government on media reform. From Los Angeles, Gerardo Monk, a Latin America specialist from the University of Southern California. And also joining us, David Holliday from the Latin America program at the Open Society Institute, a democracy and human rights think tank right here in Washington, D.C. Thanks to all of you for joining us. We'll get to the allegations of media bias in just a moment, but first let's look at this development in the Mexican election, the fact that there's going to be quite a significant major recount, more than half the ballot boxes to be individually recounted. Rick Rockwell, what does that tell us about the conduct of the Mexican election last Sunday?
Well, I just came back from Mexico City, arrived back in D.C. yesterday from there, and what I can tell you is there needs to be more confidence in the Mexican system. The Mexican electoral system, the IFE is what they call it, is doing this recount because they need to maintain this particular credibility. But having watched those elections on television and watched how the media portrayed them, I can tell you that they felt stage managed in many ways.
Yeah, one of the interesting things is that the Election Commission is conducting this recount, they say, not in response to any complaints or not in response to any kind of pressure from anyone, but because they believe that a recount needs to be done.
Well, I think that is the political thing to say, but López Obrador, the candidate who's asking on the left, many people call him AMLO, he really demands this, and there's a new student movement that is also asking for this sort of a recount. I think they need this recount for credibility reasons.
Okay, let's go to Gerardo Monk. He's in Los Angeles. Gerardo, Andrés López Obrador, who wanted a recount, and if you remember, he made a similar demand when he lost the election in 2006 to Felipe Calderón. And on both occasions, he's been called, well, basically a sore loser, that this guy just wants to bring up this issue because he can't accept the fact that he lost. But when we look at what is going on right now, I mean, does he have a point?
I think what he's doing is perfectly legal and within the framework of electoral legislation. He has asked that certain vote tallies be reviewed. That is what the IFE is doing. The IFE is really bending over backward, doing a lot more than it did last time in 2006. Then they reviewed about 9% of the polling sites. Now they're doing about 54%. The results, and this is something that the IFE has been moving very fast, is actually ratifying the results as we knew them on Sunday. It actually looks at maybe there may be a slight greater advantage for Pena Nieto, 7 instead of 6.5%. But I think it's really important for the legitimacy of this process that these questionings by López Obrador are taken seriously. The issue of the media is a different kind of thing. Here we're talking just about the vote tallying, and I think the IFE is doing a great job in terms of that.
Yeah, we'll get to the media in just a moment. Just one final thought before I get to David. Do you think, is there a chance that the election outcome could be reversed with this recount?
I don't think so. I think sort of particularly comparing to 2006, there was 0.5 percentage point, so things could have gone one way or the other. The margin of 6.5, 7 percentage points shows that I think, at least in terms of the strict sort of vote casting, vote tallying, that there is a clear winner. So I think eventually López Obrador will come about. I don't think we're going to see the protest movements that we saw 6 years ago. There are some deeper issues having to do with the role of the media that I think should be addressed. I think this is going to be an ongoing debate in Mexico and other countries in Latin America to actually make the electoral processes more equitable. I think a lot could be done to improve that.
Okay. David, the PRI, or PRI as they are known, wanted to present a new image of itself during this election. I mean, Enrique Pena Nieto was going to be the face, literally, of that new image. It was going to be a break with the past. You know, the past, all those people who are referred to sometimes very derisively as dinosaurs in Mexico. But this was going to be a big change. When we look at these latest allegations of vote rigging, does it tell us that this is not a new beginning, this is simply business as usual?
I think that there is still a lingering concern about what the PRI has done. And remember that if you look at the last few months, the PRD, López Obrador, actually surged in the polls, right. And part of that was a reaction to what seemed like for many, many months the inevitability of the PRD candidate winning. So things really tightened up lately, and I think some of the things that came out that you all reported on in terms of a relationship between Televisa and the López Obrador campaign, buying the services of a journalist to make numerous mentions of Pena Nieto, the youth movement that sort of also experienced this sort of marginalization, right, in terms of the coverage. So I think there's a strong reform movement, perhaps, and I think that that could be a positive outcome of all of this. It's good, in fact, that he didn't win by a supermajority, but that there's going to have to prove himself still.
Right. Rick, earlier on, Gerardo mentioned the student movement in Mexico, which has been gaining in strength, it would seem. To what extent do you think they influenced the outcome of the election? They've also been making some demands about media ownership, which I'll get to in a moment, but do you think they had a strong influence? I mean, did Obrador get a boost in the ratings because of student support?
Yes, I think that is a positive, and that they did bring him up in the polls. Yo soy 132 or yo soy 132. That's what the student movement is called in Mexico. They were doing marches in the main square in Mexico City on the night before the elections. They were out in the streets immediately after the elections to talk about this issue of corruption, not just within the media, but I think they propelled the media to try to look closer at these things that are coming out about the election, about buying votes, about spying on people with kids inside polling stations. These are the sorts of stories that we're hearing now that we weren't hearing immediately after the election. I think if it wasn't for the student movement, we wouldn't see the media really looking at these things in the way that they have been.
Okay, well, let's get to the issue of media bias, not just in Mexico, but in other countries in Latin America as well. Let's take a closer look at recent clashes between left-leaning governments and entrenched right-wing media interests in Latin America. Last week in Venezuela, the anti-Chavez television news channel Globovision paid more than $2 million in fines, the latest chapter in a long-running battle. The state regulator had accused Globovision of manipulating information about a prison riot and adding the sound of gunfire to its reports. In February, Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa pardoned the owners and a journalist at El Universo newspaper. They were facing jail terms and $40 million in damages for libeling him. The newspaper had branded Correa a dictator and made other unsubstantiated allegations. And in Argentina, the Kirchner government has been battling the Clarín group for years. A media law passed in 2009 seeking to diversify media ownership was seen by some as an effort to eliminate Clarin's dominant market position. David, let me start with you on this part of the show and move to the media issue. It's been a major gripe of the opposition in Mexico for some time. The argument is that this duopoly, Televisa and Azteca Television, undermines the left and reinforces the strength of the right. Is that perhaps being a little too simplistic to just look at it in terms of left and right?
Yeah, certainly. I think if you look at Latin America as a whole, it's really about concentrated ownership of the media, and whether it's television, print, or radio, and any forces that are seeking to sort of challenge or change those governments. So it's if you look to Colombia, the president was part of a big media family. I mean, historically in Latin America, the media has been owned by these big businesses and families in many cases. And so you've always had a kind of media bias there. What's new is that because of the new age, because of digital media, greater access to media, we have the ability to sort of challenge that dominance. Individuals in Latin America have that ability, and that's a very positive effect. But we can talk a lot about, obviously, what's happened in Venezuela and Ecuador are highly are not to be supported whatsoever. But they're really, those are just a few examples. If you look at other places, there's also journalists being killed in Mexico and in Colombia and Colombia and in Honduras that are not necessarily left-wing governments. So, right. And you don't have a lot of protection for those journalists. So there's a lot of issues here, and it's easy to focus on sort of the big cases, which are certainly important.
Right, but it's a lot more nuanced, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to Gerardo. Gerardo, should we expect different from these huge media conglomerates? After all, they are concentrated. That's one thing. But the other is that they're also big businesses, so they will support the right, they will support free enterprise, they will support conservative movements.
I think the issue of the media is really fundamental to the state of democracy, and this is something that we see in Latin America as well as other parts of the world. The problem in Latin America is that you have huge conglomerates that dominate huge markets of TV, radio, print, other aspects of media, so they can really sway public opinion, shape the agenda, generate candidates. We've seen this time and again in Latin America. So I think this is a very important issue. One has to balance that issue, sort of that you have media conglomerates that have their economic interests, these are corporate interests, and then the issue that's fundamental to democracy, which is a free press, alternate sources of information. I think the responses of the left have gone too far, of leftist governments, as you mentioned, in Venezuela, in Ecuador, in Argentina. You've had the president of Ecuador attack the Organization of American States that has a special rapporteur on freedom of the, expression. I think these are very negative kind of indications. But they are responding to a particular problem, that you have the media that try to set the agenda, create candidates, even going against elected presidents who have obviously popular legitimacy. So this is a very thorny issue that I think has to be addressed, and I think is going to be one of the things that is going to be addressed in the weeks and months ahead in the case of Mexico.
Okay. If I could add in, sure. I want to agree with my fellow panelists about the fact that there are excessive fines that have been levied both in Venezuela and also in Ecuador, and I believe that the president in Ecuador also took out of context some of these issues in an opinion piece about whether he was a dictator or not. And I think there is a difference between an opinion piece and a piece that's reporting fact. But on the other side, the owners who own these media properties do have a responsibility, as our colleague in Los Angeles says, about democracy. They really do need to connect the public in better ways and more informative ways about democracy in these systems, not just in Latin America, but worldwide. We could also make the same argument in the United States, and in that the media are not always as open and transparent as they should be.
Well, we see it in the United States all the time with, Fox News on the one hand and other networks on the other. David, the British newspaper The Guardian had a very good series of articles that it published recently. It published details of a unit that was set up within Televisa. I don't know whether you saw that, but it said that this unit that was set up within this huge television conglomerate in Mexico was set up to promote and help the candidacy of Pena Nieto. I mean, that is obviously something that should be investigated if there's something going on within a media organization.
Absolutely. And I think, again, one of the new developments in Latin America actually leads the world in terms of passing access to information laws. And journalists are the prime users of those laws. And I think that's how we've gotten some of the information, or just the very fact that a new agenda set that there's a higher degree of transparency that's being demanded. I mean, you mentioned a unit in the case of Televisa, but in other countries you could talk about entire enterprises that were essentially propaganda units for an incumbent president. Yeah. Especially in very polarized situations where the media is. And part of this, I think, also has to be contextualized in the sense that over the last few years there are challenges sort of to dominant conservative governments. There's a number of left-wing governments who have, or left-wing parties who have come into power, and so you are going to have this a greater contentiousness within politics and between the government and the media.
Yeah, Rick, would it be fair
something about the Mexican
case? Go ahead,
Gerard.
Gerard.
One thing that's fundamental, hasn't been addressed, I just want to introduce it, has to do with the use of polling data. One of the things that you saw in the media in Mexico early on in the campaign, 3 months ago, is the use of polling data that showed Enrique Pena Nieto with a 15-20% lead. A really huge lead that seemed, okay, it was a done deal, he's a front runner, there's not much that you can do. It ends up that the difference may be 6.5, 7 points. So there is something to be discussed about sort of what is the actual sort of the legal use of polling data, whether you can use that, how you can use it, methodologies in swaying public opinion.
Are you saying that polling data actually influences the way people vote? Or perhaps influences turnout?
If I hear that there's a certain candidate that's 20% ahead, it seems to, I'm getting a sense of what my fellow citizens are thinking. If I'm sort of swaying, prefer an opposition candidate, I may not turn out. So that has a huge impact. I think polling data is one of the most potent things. And there was a clear mismatch in the case of Mexico between what we were hearing a month, 2 months ago and what eventually came about. So I think that has a big impact, yes.
And Gerardo points out rightly that there's also a bandwagon effect. People want to vote for a winner in some cases rather than actually vote their own mind. And so I think that is also influenced by the media. And to add to David's point, historically, Televisa has backed the Institutional Revolutionary Party. They are members of the PRI, the owners of that family that owns that network, series of networks, they have said many times that they are party supporters. So it's no surprise to me that they had set up this special unit.
And I guess polling data also influences turnout. You know, some guy sitting there saying, well, I'm not going to bother to go out and vote because it's over. You know, the guy's leading by 20 points or whatever.
But you know, I think the interesting thing in Latin America is that despite all of this, you can see that elites are losing control. The media doesn't determine turnout. And when Chavez closed RCTV in 2007, 2008, there was a reaction against that, and he lost a referendum. So there's a, I think the new sort of
overreaction on his part.
There was a new there's a new media ecosystem in which there's a plurality of voices. It's only going to increase, and so there's a new empowerment of sort of civic organizations, of interest groups, of individuals to really kind of express themselves and have other options. So it's amazing. I find it amazing in places where there is a very dominant media, in a place like El Salvador, where the dominant media is very conservative, that the left can win despite all the negative propaganda.
So it's not because of the media that you're getting, you know, left-wing candidates winning elections.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. The situation you mentioned, Venezuela. Globovision has just been fined more than $2 million for its coverage of a prison riot, but free press advocates say no, it's not that. It's actually an attack on press freedom. Rick?
It is an attack on press freedom. It's an excessive fine. I don't agree with juicing up sound or doing that sort of thing.
Right.
It's unethical and perhaps illegal in the Venezuelan case. Not being a lawyer and not knowing enough about the Venezuelan laws, I can't tell you about the legality of that, but it seems to me that $2 million, those sorts of fines, and the fines that were cited in Ecuador, $40 million, those sorts of fines are meant to put a media organization out of business. That means to silence a voice. Whether that voice is a conservative voice or a voice of a particular entrepreneurial class or an oligarchy, that's still a voice. And in a democratic system, we have to respect all voices. We need more room for more voices, but you shouldn't be silencing voices.
Right.
So I think what you see in places, that's a good example of, it only affects perhaps a small television station with not the biggest viewership, but it sends a signal to everybody else. And I think throughout Latin America, these sorts of maneuvers contribute to self-censorship by journalists themselves, by the media owners themselves. They know they can't cross a certain line, and that's a huge problem. Another example of sort of soft censorship, if you will, is sort of the power of the government to buy advertising, with many it sounds like a simple thing, but in any small outlet, which may want to challenge sort of the dominant opinions, depends on the private sector funding advertising or government advertising, and the government often uses that as a lever to sort of to let an institution or a news outlet die or strengthen it.
Right, and in many instances, governments control the price of newsprint or subsidize it to some extent. Let's go to Gerardo. Gerardo, is there any media in Latin America that can be seen as a model? You know, maybe perhaps Brazil or Chile?
In terms of a model, I'd say sort of there are two things. There's one sort of the legal framework, another sort of the issue of concentration. I think in Latin America you have many countries, I'd include Brazil here, sort of Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, Mexico, that you have very high concentration of media ownership. So I think sort of that economic power is a problem. The breaking up of some of these corporations, sort of so that you don't have one single voice that's so influential, I think would be a step forward. In terms of the legal aspects, and this that has to do specifically with elections, I think Mexico is actually a model. And this is, I think, since we're talking about certain problems in Mexico, also to highlight the positive. These are changes that come from the late 1990s, but sort of were accelerated towards the end of the 2000s. You have a system that is actually designed very clearly to have more equitable access to the media. Right. One of the things that you have in terms of the legislation in Mexico, candidates' parties cannot buy spots, advertisements on the media. The media, the TV and the radio have to cede certain spaces to the government, and the IFE then distributes it to the different political parties.
Okay.
So one thing that sort of is a costly aspect and that then excludes certain groups from access to the media is something that's actually being tackled fairly well in Mexico.
Okay, thank you, Gerardo, and thanks to you, Rick, and David as well. Time's run out. Thanks for being on the show with us. And that is it from the team here in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And of course, we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching.